Welcome everyone again to today's event, Building Back Better, Paving the Way Towards an Inclusive and Diverse Post-Pandemic World. My name is Jessica Stern. I'm the Executive Director of Outright International, and I'll chair this event today. Outright, for those of you who don't know us, is a global feminist and LGBTIQ rights organization with staff in 7 countries across the global North and South. There is interpretation available in English and Spanish. Please go to the interpretation icon at the bottom of your screen, the globe, and select from the drop-down menu the language of your choice. Please also take a moment to introduce yourself in the chat, your name, pronouns, where you work, and what country you live in. And I want to warmly welcome you to the annual events of the LGBTI core group. The core group is a coalition of 33 member states, the European Union, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Human Rights Watch, and Outright International, and it is co-chaired by Argentina and the Netherlands. And I'm very happy to say that this is the core group's 5th annual event in honor of today, May 17th, the International Day Against Homophobia, Biphobia, Intersex Phobia, and Transphobia. And while we all agree that we need justice, we don't agree on how to pronounce today's acronym or even how many letters are in the acronym. So my guess is that you'll hear Idaho, IDAHOT, IDAHOT, and probably some other variations. It's all welcome, so long as it's said with a commitment to today's lofty ideals, human rights for everyone, everywhere. We will have a wonderful program of speakers and videos, and then we'll have a robust Q&A at the end. But I want to invite you to not wait until the end to share your thinking. One of the joyful things about using Zoom, and yes, there are joyful things about using Zoom, is that you can share your reactions in the chat throughout our discussion in real time. We really welcome you to do so. So that being said, our housekeeping details are done, and it is now my pleasure to introduce the permanent representative of the Netherlands, Her Excellency Joka Brandt, who is speaking for the first time at the core group IDAHOT events. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Jessica. And it is indeed, I'm very proud. It is my first IDAHOT event indeed in New York. So good morning, dear friends and colleagues. And as Jessica just said, today on the 17th of May, we mark the International Day Against Homophobia, Transphobia, and Biphobia, or in short, IDAHOT. And I do say this with a full commitment to the lofty ideals that you were just talking about, Jessica. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this special event on this special day on behalf of the co-chairs of the UN LGBTI core group, Argentina and the Kingdom of the Netherlands. Now, the COVID-19 pandemic has caused immense human suffering and triggered one of the worst socioeconomic crises in recent history. And although the virus has impacted virtually everyone everywhere, LGBTI persons have been disproportionately affected. And that is because the pandemic has also exacerbated pre-existing structural inequalities, discrimination, and inclusion. It is therefore essential that the intersecting needs of LGBTI persons are taken into account when putting together and implementing global, national, and local response plans. And that is why the focus of today's IDAHOT event is on the full, equal, and meaningful participation in the broadest sense of the word of LGBTI persons in post-pandemic recovery. I'm very happy that we have with us guests who will represent different stakeholders and who will share different perspectives on how to pave the way towards a truly inclusive and diverse post-pandemic world. And of course, Jessica, I'm really happy that you have agreed to be our moderator today. We only have 1 hour, so I think it's best if I hand it straight over to you, Jessica, but not, of course, before I again thank everybody for being with us today and wish everybody an interesting and successful event. Over to you, Jessica.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Those were powerful remarks. You even said some of the things I was planning to say. So I don't know, that means on the one hand, you're smashing success. And on the other hand, I hope that you don't speak again too soon, because everything that you say is sort of the perfect framework for the remarks and topics of the discussion. But seriously, thank you and welcome to your first IDAHOT event with the core group. Now we're going to switch gears. We're going to show you the first of 2 videos that we'll screen during today's panel. And the videos are made up of testimonies from some of the grantees from Outright's COVID LGBTIQ emergency fund. When the pandemic hit last year, Outright realized that LGBTIQ people worldwide would slip through the traditional emergency interventions, because this is what the history of disaster around the world has taught us. And so we invested in LGBTIQ organizations on the front lines. And the reasoning was simple. LGBTIQ organizations are the essential workers for LGBTIQ people. Outright's fund is now the largest LGBTIQ COVID emergency fund in the world, having distributed $1 million to 125 organizations across 64 countries. And I'll be clear with you, that's just a fraction of the need. So I'd like to ask everyone to really pay attention in the videos, because we're going to hear directly from extraordinary LGBTIQ human rights defenders describing the need at the community level, and also the creative and urgent emergency interventions they undertook. So as we listen to video number 1, we're going to hear testimonies from Haven for Artists in Lebanon, the Humsafar Trust in India, and One Action Foundation in Nigeria. And now, if my colleague would please start the videos.
Hello, my name is Dana Ash, and I'm the Executive Director of Paving for Artists based in Beirut, Lebanon.
Hi, my name is Lgbtiq, and I manage the relief work for all the communities that were affected by the Beirut blast.
Since the Beirut blast, we've been working diligently to ensure that we can reach out to our entire community and give them all the support that they need, as well as working with the coalition to ensure that it's cohesively and comprehensively being covered. Thanks to Outright, we've been able to continue our efforts to distribute various kinds of aid according to the things that we've been able to raise thanks to local, regional, and international donors.
Our aid varies from rent assistance to cash assistance to ensure autonomy and agency for the people receiving the aid, as well as hygiene kits and baby kits, as well as food and medication, so that we can ensure that our community is receiving the best help that we can give them.
My name is Vivek Anand, and I work as the Chief Executive Officer of the Humsafar Trust, which is India's first LGBTQ organization based out of Mumbai in India. This pandemic has hit the LGBTQ communities very hard, but with timely support from Outright Action International, we have been able to reach out to almost 550 impacted community members with ration, groceries, mental health support, and access to HIV treatment in a very timely manner. And we wish to offer our thanks to them.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jennifer. I am the Executive Director of One Action Foundation based in Nigeria. I'd like to say a big thank you to Outright for providing us with the emergency funding. With this funding, we were able to help LGBTQI youths who are struggling with homelessness, who are struggling with financial difficulties, who are struggling with their mental health, because at the end of the day, we were able to help them out with feeding, with medication, laundry services. We linked them up with different mental health practitioners. So thank you very much.
At One Action, we're building back by building communities, stronger communities among the queer community within Nigeria. We're also putting out informative posts about sexual and mental health for queer folk. And we're also looking forward to celebrating Pride this
year. I find that video to be quite moving. And if our colleagues from Haven for Artists, Humsafar Trust, and One Action Foundation are on the webinar, I just want to thank you so much for your incredible work. And, you know, to the members of the audience, I would just note that each of the three organizations describe a similar pattern of need. Crisis of economic interventions like food distribution and emergency shelter support, plus a mental health crisis. And their testimonies are consistent with what research tells us about how COVID-19 has impacted LGBTIQ people around the world. So let me just provide a little bit of data. Outright published a study a year ago to sound the alarm about the impact of COVID-19 on LGBTIQ people. It's called Vulnerability Amplified, aptly named. And we interviewed leading LGBTIQ human rights defenders from around the world, and we found several critical areas of crisis related to the pandemic. The first was economic crisis, as you heard from the three organizations. LGBTIQ people were more likely to be poor before the pandemic. And so they had fewer means to access or maintain food or shelter when they were cut off from their livelihoods because of the crisis. The second is a spike in domestic and family violence. The third is a dangerous drop in health, and I mean both physical health and mental health, as people were confined at home with homophobic and transphobic families, or access to life-affirming care, like access to hormone treatment, was deemed optional care as public health resources were redirected to the pandemic. The fourth was the phenomenon of backlash. So in many places around the world, we found that LGBTIQ people were actually blamed for the pandemic, as though we somehow brought it on our communities or brought it on this earth. And of course, that kind of hate speech has only triggered increased violence and discrimination against the community, which is manifested at the community level, but also in draconian laws and policies. The fifth point I want to emphasize is we've actually seen the destabilization of LGBTIQ organizations. Yes, when I talk about LGBTIQ organizations, I'm talking about what amounts to our own first responders who found themselves facing unstable finances, as of course donations were called into question as the world slumped into a recession, but also at the same time, they were facing skyrocketing community demands. So as the Dutch ambassador said, 1 year into the pandemic, the data is crystal clear. COVID-19 exacerbated inequalities for marginalized communities, all marginalized communities, including LGBTI people. And I just want to share that Outright ran 2 rounds of calls for a COVID LGBTIQ emergency fund, one about a year ago and one most recently. And in the first round, we received about $15 million in requests for emergency need. There's an astronomical number for a call for proposals that was only out for 3 weeks. And we're now about to make a new round of grants. And I have to say, we received the exact same number of appeals for funds, 1,500 both times, so more than 3,000 organizations on the front lines serving LGBTIQ communities. But shockingly, the financial need has grown. So this time we received over $20 million in requests for emergency assistance. So what does it tell us? A year into the pandemic, the queer community is as vulnerable or more vulnerable than we were at the start. So I mentioned this to say, you know, we need pandemic relief efforts to be inclusive of LGBTI community concerns and to directly include the participation of LGBTI people. And so it feels quite apropos that we're about to hear from 2 officials working at the level of capital to discuss the need to include LGBTI persons in pandemic relief so that we can build back better. And so I'd like to invite our first 2 speakers from the governments of Argentina and Spain to turn their videos on, please. We're going to hear from Alba Rueda, Undersecretary for Diversity Policies Ministry of Women, Genders, we love that, and Diversity in Argentina. Alba, I'll be asking you to please answer the question first, or I should say Undersecretary Rueda, excuse me. And we'll also be hearing from Fernando Fernandez Arias, Director General for United Nations, International Organizations, and Human Rights at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the European Union, and Cooperation of Spain. And the question we'd like to put to both of you is the following. We know how important it is for government policies to explicitly mention and include marginalized communities in order to ensure their protection in COVID response efforts. Can you tell us how your respective governments have worked to include LGBTI communities in recovery efforts? Please, Undersecretary Rueda, you have the floor.
Muchísimas gracias, muy buen día a todos. Aquí en Argentina es horario de la mañana. Quiero saludar a todo el grupo LGBTIQ+, ahí en IDAHOT, y también recuperar esta reflexión sobre el Día Internacional de Lucha contra la homofobia, lesbo, bi, transfobia, y principalmente decirles que aquí en Argentina justamente resituamos este día para poder llamarlo en el Día de Lucha contra la Discriminación por orientación sexual e identidad de género, también teniendo en cuenta los compromisos que implica a nuestros gobiernos trabajar activamente respecto a la erradicación de la discriminación y la violencia hacia las personas LGBTIQ+ en Argentina. Principalmente también quiero saludar especialmente a nuestras compañeras y compañeros en el Ministerio de Relaciones Exteriores, Comercio Internacional y Culto, porque en el día de hoy sacaron una resolución, la resolución 82, que instala de manera transversal el eje de la diversidad para ser parte del ministerio, tanto en los contenidos de formación, así como también en nuestra representación política internacional. Esto lo celebro porque es, por supuesto, un dato significativo. Respecto a nosotros, y qué hicimos en este tiempo respecto a la pandemia y la población LGBTIQ+, me parece que uno de los primeros datos fue responder a la demanda alimentaria, por supuesto, incorporando por primera vez a gran parte de la población trans y travesti en Argentina a las áreas sustantivas del gobierno nacional que trabajan y apoyan con alimentos a la población. Así también el enlace de nuestro gobierno fue con los gobiernos provinciales y municipales. Esto es un hecho que debería haberse dado, por supuesto, desde siempre, pero esto no sucedía en Argentina, así que uno de los primeros ejes para destacar ha sido la respuesta alimentaria. Otro de las cuestiones es incorporar a la población trans dentro de la economía social. Más de 6.000 personas trans se han incorporado en el programa Potenciar Trabajo, que involucra una transferencia económica que representa la mitad de un salario mínimo vital y móvil, y por supuesto con la posibilidad de duplicarlo, es decir, llegar al salario mínimo vital y móvil a través de lo que son la inclusión en proyectos productivos, y ese es un dato muy significativo. Otro de los datos también para tener en cuenta ha sido nuestro decreto del año 2020, el decreto 721, que nuestro gobierno ha establecido para que al menos el 1% del total de trabajadoras y trabajadores del sector público nacional sean personas trans. Es decir, vamos a trabajar y estamos trabajando para que al menos el 1% del sector público nacional haya trabajadoras y trabajadores trans. A la fecha hemos cuadruplicado ese diagnóstico inicial con el que empezamos, es decir, el nivel de contratación a personas trans en el Estado se ha cuadruplicado a través de lo que ha sido este corto periodo de tiempo. No hicimos un año y ya hemos avanzado. Y otro dato fue crear incentivos a las empresas privadas en más de 10 provincias argentinas a través del régimen de promoción a la generación del empleo en el norte grande. Justamente una política de gobierno a través de lo que es una reducción de aportes tributarios por si contratan a personas personas travestis y trans, que llegan hasta el 80% para favorecer las contrataciones de personal trans dentro de los ámbitos laborales. Y otro de los grandes ejes que se ha, por supuesto, trabajado aquí en Argentina ha sido el fortalecimiento del sistema de salud. Sacamos el año pasado, en el 8 de abril del 2020, justamente todo un boletín informativo dando cuenta de que no se paraban las atenciones en la salud integral para las personas LGBTI+. Es decir, tanto en los temas de VIH como de hormonas, como de tratamientos hormonales y cirugías, han continuado en este periodo de tiempo de pandemia. Otro de los ejes también para destacar es un enorme compromiso que tiene nuestro gobierno, tanto desde el Ministerio de las Mujeres, Géneros y Diversidad, así como el Ministerio de Seguridad y la Secretaría de Derechos Humanos. Hemos creado los lineamientos para adecuar normativas discriminatorias que criminalizan a las mujeres cis, trans y travestis dentro de lo que son los códigos contravencionales de falta y de convivencia en Argentina. Ya estamos trabajando con 4 gobiernos provinciales para erradicar la violencia institucional hacia las personas hacia la población LGBTI+, y especialmente hacia la población trans. Me queda simplemente señalar y destacar que hay un programa de fortalecimiento en el acceso a derechos para personas trans, que por supuesto también tiene un enfoque integral que desarrollamos en el Ministerio, y el programa Acompañar, que es un programa para las situaciones de violencia por motivos de género, que incluye por supuesto a la población LGBTIQ+. Y actualmente, y cierro con esto, tenemos un compromiso, hemos lanzado el Plan de Igualdad en la Diversidad, que cuenta con más de 200 compromisos de todo el gobierno nacional para trabajar para erradicar la discriminación y la violencia por motivos de género, especialmente teniendo en cuenta justamente la igualdad en la diversidad, teniendo como población destinataria la población LGBTIQ+. Así que bueno, nuestros compromisos son a través de lo que es una convicción de gobierno en Argentina. Falta mucho, falta trabajar puntualmente para erradicar muchos de los ámbitos significativos que hoy cobran la vida de las personas trans, pero creemos que estamos adelantando en pasos sólidos para este objetivo. Saludo entonces a todos y muchísimas gracias por este tiempo en la intervención. Gracias.
Thank you so much, Undersecretary. That was incredibly inspiring. And it's really quite wonderful to hear that in April 2020, as the pandemic was impacting all parts of life, that you issued a pamphlet saying that LGBTI related care like HIV care and access to hormones would remain a priority. You know, some people might hear pamphlet, why is that worth mentioning? I hear that and I think that's a really big deal, because we know in how many jurisdictions people were cut off from access to healthcare, or the government didn't make it clear that it would continue. So very inspiring, and I hope that you'll come back next year and tell us about the fulfillments of those 200 commitments to eradicate discrimination based on gender. Wonderful. And now I'm so pleased to go next to you, Director General. Please, the same question.
Muchas gracias y muchas gracias por invitarme a participar en este panel por primera vez. Al igual que en el caso de Argentina, en el caso de mi país, en España, tenemos un claro compromiso de gobierno con los derechos de quienes formamos parte del colectivo LGTBIQ+, etc. Y somos muy conscientes de que la pandemia de COVID-19 ha agravado mucho las vulnerabilidades que ya sufrían muchas personas LGTBI y poniendo en riesgo, sobre todo, muchos de los avances que ya se habían producido y que ya habíamos conocido, sobre todo en la lucha contra la discriminación y contra la violencia, y muy específicamente respecto a las personas trans. Las personas trans, sobre todo las mujeres trans, han sido especialmente afectadas por la situación, sometidas ya a numerosas discriminaciones estructurales que obstaculizan su acceso en concreto al mercado del trabajo, al mercado laboral. Y muchas veces estas mujeres con frecuencia se ven abocadas a situación de violencia, de pobreza, explotación sexual, tráfico de personas marginalidad y dificultad para acceder a servicios básicos. Y es por ello que nosotros durante la pandemia, el Ministerio de Igualdad en España puso en marcha también, como en Argentina, un amplio plan de medidas para dar respuestas a los principales impactos de esta crisis en los derechos humanos de las personas LGTBI. Había medidas urgentes y también medidas que podían afectar sobre todo al acceso a servicios básicos, por ejemplo, servicios de salud, pero también medidas de transición que nos permitan afrontar más adelante el periodo de recuperación post-crisis. Pensamos que este segundo momento, el momento de transición que esperamos pueda empezar en breve, nos permitirá consolidar este sistema de protección efectiva de los derechos de todas las personas LGTBI. Hay alguna medida muy parecida a la medida que comentaba la subsecretaria Rueda. En España hemos publicado unas guías rápidas, que están también publicadas en las páginas web. Todo el mundo puede tener acceso, están también en papel. Y hemos hecho unas guías, una para víctimas de delitos de odio por LGTB-fobia, otras para víctimas de violencia intragénero, una más sobre salud, incluyendo salud física y también salud mental, y una muy específica para que las personas LGTBI puedan identificar los recursos con los que pueden hacer frente a situaciones de exclusión social y discriminación por orientación sexual e identidad de género durante la pandemia. Nosotros hemos trasladado, a nuestra manera también, todas estas premisas al mundo exterior y proyectamos al exterior a través de nuestra cooperación internacional, a través de nuestras embajadas y consulados a lo largo y ancho del mundo, estos principios, y precisamente coincidiendo con IDAHOT, el Día de Lucha contra la LGTBI-fobia, si lo puedo llamar así, hemos enviado instrucciones a todas las embajadas y consulados y oficinas de España en el mundo para que lleven a cabo actividades de apoyo a los derechos LGTB.
Thank you so much, Director General Fernandez Arias, for that incredibly clear analysis of the kinds of exclusion that LGBTI people face in the context of COVID, and the heightened vulnerabilities that trans women face. And it's really great to hear that literally on the government's own website and in print materials you made available, that you're creating resources that address some of the pervasive experiences of LGBTI people, from the experience of hate crimes to resources for mental health situations and beyond. And I also really appreciate that you mentioned the importance of conveying similar clarity and importance to embassies and consulates around the world. I think that's just absolutely essential. The connective tissue between domestic and foreign policy is obvious to us at the UN, but isn't always as obvious globally. And I think we have to do right in both spaces. So thank you so much for your words. I'd like to now invite the next speaker to please turn on her video and prepare to speak. It's my great pleasure. Hello, wonderful to see you. It is my great pleasure to welcome UN Assistant Secretary General Ilza Brans-Keres, who will also pronounce her name better than I did, as needed. Assistant Secretary General, thank you very much for joining us for IDAHOT. It means a lot to have support from the highest levels of the UN. And I wanted to ask you a question. During the pandemic, the UN has been seen as a focal point for COVID recovery by everyone who's paying attention. Can you share with us the way in which your office and the UN generally has worked to ensure that recovery responses are inclusive of all communities, including LGBTI communities?
Thank you very much, Jessica, and thanks to the core group also for this year's IDAHOT, and it's great to be here at a time where sadly it's even more important than ever to keep the human rights of LGBTIQ+ high on the agenda. So good to be here. And I won't go into all of the exclusion, discrimination, stigma, and so on that other speakers, starting with Ambassador Brandt, already mentioned. It obviously is very concerning, and this past year has been worse than ever, although it based on pre-existing already patterns. I just wanted to say in that regard that we also should see that in parallel to the direct COVID responses that have those effects, we also have other developments like the restrictions on the rights of transgender people, in particularly also laws limiting access to recognition of gender identity that have been adopted in several countries and amended, and also the civil society pressure that you mentioned, Jessica, at first, which I think is something in parallel, but worsened by the COVID crisis that we really should be watching out for, both in terms of the funding, as you mentioned, but also we know the pressures on human rights defenders and reprisals and so on overall. So very important parallel processes. Our office responded early on last April. We issued guidance, specific practical guidance to state on the impact of the pandemic on LGBTI people, and also concrete steps that could be taken to ensure that there is an inclusive response. The focus particularly overall in the COVID response on vulnerable groups, but then making sure that there's very specific guidance for LGBTI as well. We know the UN independent expert, as you probably all well know, Victor Madrigal-Borloz, also issued the Aspire guidelines that he presented to the General Assembly that are quite comprehensive in a response to COVID in addressing both discrimination and violence, but also a very strong focus on participation and data collection, actually, that we fully agree with. And many of our country offices have actually worked very specifically. So it's very important, of course, to adjust that guidance to the context in each country. So I won't go into those examples, we don't have time, but just to mention that it's global. So we have examples from ranging from Brazil, Mongolia, Serbia, Mexico, Vietnam, Timor-Leste, and so very specific work at the country level that we have done. And Vanya, I'd like to mention as well the Secretary General, because you were talking about highest level of the UN. So it's great to see that, of course, the response that the Secretary General issued a policy guidance on COVID and human rights early on last year that included specifically this focus on vulnerable groups and making sure that human rights are at the center of the response and also for building back better. So a lot has been done, but unfortunately, of course, we know it's not enough. It's only the beginning, and we are in discussions with and collaboration with other parts of the UN to make sure that we really take this forward in partnership with governments. And certainly, the important role of the core group is something that we base also our partnerships on, and we will continue this work to make sure the guidance is actually implemented. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Assistant Secretary General. We really appreciate that, and it was certainly good to see the SG's statement in honor of IDAHOT, which we welcome. You know, since we have you here, and since I am an advocate, I, of course, just want to express the value of distinctly naming LGBTI people in as many of those documents about marginalized groups as possible. It just matters so much, you know, I mean, and the data is quite clear that LGBTI people fall through the cracks. So where you can set the highest standard, it really helps. Thank you very much. And I wish you a very joyful IDAHOT, full of good work for the community. I am now going to invite our next speaker, who is having some technical challenges beyond her control. And I'm hoping that Liberty Matesa, excuse me, the Executive Director of Gender Dynamics, has been able to prevail over her local Wi-Fi infrastructure and can turn on her camera now. Let's see, Liberty, how are you doing? I'm just checking the chat to see. Oh, there you are, Liberty. Very happy that, look at how strong you are. Advocates can prevail even over technology. Of course, we're going to succeed in changing laws and policies. Liberty, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's really an honor to have you here. You know, in your role as Executive Director of Gender Dynamics, an organization I hope you'll introduce and explain to everyone, you've been doing so much from your home in South Africa to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. Can you explain a little bit about what the impact on trans people in South Africa has been from the pandemic, and even the broader LGBTI community, if you wish, and also what you've been able to do in terms of recovery efforts?
Certainly, Jessica, and thank you so much for having me be part of the discussion today. To answer the first part of the question, Gender Dynamics is a trans-led and a trans-specific human rights organization that is based in Cape Town, South Africa, and we pursue human rights advancements across not only South Africa, but also the broader Southern Africa region. And we predominantly work in partnership with other in-country partners, and then of course with the Southern Africa Trans Forum, that's the coordinating mechanism for the trans movement in Southern Africa. So that is in a nutshell who we are. We've been in existence for about 15 years. I think in looking at COVID-19 and the impact that it has had on the community, and I do want to narrow the focus a bit to trans and gender diverse persons specifically, because that is the scope of the work that we do, notwithstanding some of the work that we do with broader LGBTQI+ communities. So as we got caught in the grip of COVID-19 in March 2020, like much of the world has been dead before then, and subsequently to that as well, we were faced with very particular questions around what does that look like for the ongoing work of the organization that's predominantly an advocacy organization. And we found ourselves increasingly needing to fulfill a service delivery role in order to meet the demands of the time. People needed, our communities needed material relief. And so of course, advocacy initiatives were put on the back burner. So amongst many of the interventions that we then developed, we developed a consolidated approach, which was the COVID-19 Regional Response Project. And through that, we were able to identify the needs that communities had through the online conversations platform called Amplifying the Voices of Trans and Gender Diverse Persons in Southern Africa. On this particular platform that ran for about 5 months, we identified that unemployment is the key issue that is leading to exposure to human rights violations. Many people reported being locked in during lockdown with unsupportive families, and you spoke about this earlier on, that of course had its mental strain and resulted in significant mental trauma. People feeling isolated, being on the precipice of depression and suicidal ideation. And of course, we needed to act on that and put in place a mental wellness and leadership support facility through which we were able then to channel support digitally to community members across the region, drawing from the 23 partners that we worked with. In addition to that, we also noted that organizations, basically being on the front lines of the support that needed to be rendered to communities, were struggling themselves as the demand for support increased. Organizational capacities remained the same, both human resource capacities as well as financial capacities. And of course, that put a strain on what organizations were able to achieve. We were able to support our partners with financial support in being able to cover some of the expenses associated in rendering the support. There's, of course, in this particular part of the world, a big digital divide in terms of who gets access to online spaces and opportunity, given the infrastructure, lack of infrastructure in terms of connectivity, but also the lack of money and resources to afford data to connect online. And that was a need that we needed to take care of as well. in lieu of leadership support, because of the excessive expectations that were placed on leaders, there was a different facility made available, which was specifically channeled towards supporting leaders and senior staff within nascent emerging organizations. There's also been a great lack of access to information. And of course, that is also very much tied in to lack of access to knowledge and data about trans and gender diverse communities across the region. We then developed an information toolkit to basically support trans and gender diverse persons during this time in identifying spaces of support, spaces of service delivery that were still open. Two of the biggest issues, I think, that still goes unaddressed, and these are, of course, concerns predating COVID-19 and will likely outlast COVID-19 if we do not use certain resources and mechanisms as opportunities to address them here and now. And that ties down to legal gender recognition and gender affirming healthcare. Legal gender recognition, most of the countries across Southern Africa do not have affirming laws and policies allowing for the changing of gender markers and name changes, or name changes that is. But in addition to that, even the countries that do have enabling legislation, let's say for South Africa and Namibia, it is very difficult to access the benefits that comes part and parcel with it based on how the laws are conceptualized and then implemented. For one, it is very much reliant on a biomedical model of pathologization. Of course, many people not having access to medical and surgical affirming healthcare in this context then means people are not able to access the rights that accrue to us through law in that particular instance. So that has been an age-old challenge, and that was compounded further when we saw the suspension of these legal gender recognition amendment services with the Department of Home Affairs requiring intervention. And as of the end of last year, September, October, we then shifted back into, after consulting with the Department of Home Affairs, shifted back into getting legal gender recognition back onto the table. But the same can be said for gender affirming medical and surgical care that was rendered a non-essential service during lockdown. And I think one of the ongoing conversations and debates with our governments are that it is not elective non-essential services. These are life-saving and life-changing services. And so the battle, of course, continues in terms of how we are pursuing this particular matters. But at this particular point, we are midway through implementing the COVID-19 Regional Response Project, and that is set then to end at the end of June, July of this year, with the hopes of it being ongoing, because the fallout and the impact of COVID-19 is going to be long lasting. And so there's a great need for governments to take accountability for what they need to take accountability for in being able to deliver services, resources, and care to communities. And at the same time, from a donor vantage point, there's a continued need for investment into civil society organizations to be able to drive relief efforts to communities where our governments are failing us at this time.
Liberty, that was very powerful. Thank you so much for your comments. And I really appreciate you making such an explicit connection between the crisis that trans and gender diverse people face now and the long-term systematic challenges, including an inadequate model of healthcare, inadequate pathways to gender identity recognition. And I think that's so important, because if the framework of this event and the framework of what we're all doing is to build back better, then the question is, how can we put in place the infrastructure to come out of this with a more inclusive society? So I really appreciate that. What I'm going to do momentarily, actually, Liberty, before you turn your camera off, we always take a sort of family photo. And I thought I would try to do that at this point in the program, just because why not bring all of these extraordinary speakers back? So if everyone who has had a speaking role or will have a speaking role would please join us Thank you so much, Director General Fernandez Arias. You're a leader, turning your video on. We want all of the beautiful faces because, you know, in person, it would be very exciting to stand together in front of all the flags, but we will work in the Zoom context that we have. So I know the permanent representative of the Dutch mission in New York had to leave. We have the DPR here. Welcome. It's so good to have you. I'm trying to check. It looks like we have everybody that I'm aware of, and no one is sending me a message saying you've forgotten 10 people. So in that case, I'm now asking my colleagues who are taking the picture to be ready. I'm asking everyone who has their camera on to look sharp, and let's smile while they take our picture. I love that, Undersecretary Rueda. And let's do one more thing. It's IDAHOT, right? This is the day when we protest discrimination and violence against LGBTI people. What's one of the best ways of protesting is to show love. So let's all make a little heart with our hands to show that we love LGBTI rights and LGBTI people. Wonderful. Thank you all for indulging that. I appreciate that. Okay, you can turn your camera off now for a moment while we go to a video. And now, following Liberty's remarks, we're going to have the second and final video where we feature remarks from Fundación Amal in Argentina, from Bimba in Kiribati, from Jinsiangu in Kenya, and from the Blue Diamond Society in Nepal. Colleagues, please cue the video.
Hello, my name is Mariano Ruiz, and I'm project coordinator at Fundación Amal Argentina in Buenos Aires, Argentina. To Build Back Better, we help 25 LGBTIQ migrants and refugees and their families with basic humanitarian care during the pandemic. The assistance included a monthly stipend to help them pay their rents, weekly distribution of food and hygiene supplies, virtual psychological support, and workshops with tools for them to be able to find a job. The COVID Emergency Fund helped to guarantee the access to housing, food and hygiene supplies, and psychological support of 25 LGBTIQ migrants and their dependents.
Melody from Kiribati. My name is Tabeya Dampton, and I'm the advisor and co-founder of Paving, the only LGBT network in Kiribati. The Outright Global LGBTIQ COVID-19 Emergency Fund had assisted Paving members in their preparation for the pandemic, and one of the highlights was the development of the Pandemic Rapid Alert and Response Plan. The Pandemic Rapid Alert and Response Plan was developed by Bimba with the assistance and guidance of key organizations working for the prevention and preparedness plans for COVID-19 in the country. It is an important document because it can inform and instruct the LGBT community and other vulnerable individuals on how to access essential services and to stay connected and support each other during the pandemic, especially during lockdowns. On behalf of Pimba, thank you so much, OAI. Professor Lava.
Hi, my name is Ava. I work with Jinsiangu. Jinsiangu is based in East Africa, that's in Kenya. In Building Back Better, with the funds provided by Attract International, we were able to provide essential needs to our community, that being food, sanitization products, and we were able to facilitate access to mental health services that were in need during this period. A lot of people were struggling with the socioeconomic needs, and with the fund provided, we were able to pay for school fees for our members and community. With this, we're also able to facilitate access to gender affirming care and legal aid services. With this, we'd like to thank Outreach International for the support provided.
Hi everyone, my name is Manisha Thakal from Blue Diamond Society Nepal. We were able to support relief assistance to our LGBTIQ community through the support from Outright Action and other supporters. This support means a lot to our community to cope with hunger, mental health issues, and other health-related issues. Now we are facing second wave of coronavirus. I'd like to request all the supporters, donors, government of Nepal to include us in their priority list to support us for relief assistance, vaccination, and stigma and discrimination-free treatment. Thank you.
My appreciation goes out to Fundación Amal, Bimba, Jinsiangu, and Blue Diamond Society for the colleagues' amazing work. And I just want to appreciate especially what Manisha said. You know, it sort of tugs at the heartstrings to know what's happening with regard to the COVID crisis in Nepal right now. And I just want to say, you know, we hear you and we amplify your call for support for the situation you all face. I'm mindful of time. We promised you we would try to do this event in an hour, which is not easy to do when we're also passionate about fighting for LGBTI rights. And we wanted to have a Q&A. And we also have a couple of people that are yet to speak. So let me just sort of share my impression of the Q&A. I think in the chats, first of all, I want to thank everyone for jumping in with your anger and your frustration. And I think what's so interesting in looking at the chat is how many people from doing very diverse kinds of work from very different parts of the world all find value in tuning in for this event. I'm looking at people working for hospitals, people conducting research, people from UN agencies and international agencies, journalists joining in, Global North, Global South. Thank you all for your comments and the sort of collective desire to hold space together and also to figure out how to do this work more effectively. There were only a couple of explicit questions. One was, will the recording of this event be made available? And the answer is yes, absolutely. There's a website for the LGBTI core group. It's unlgbticoregroup.org. So please go there for information about this event and future events. And then there were a couple of questions from someone named Molly Williams on a few different topics, including how governments around the world are addressing LGBTIQ people and homelessness in the context of the pandemic. And also a more esoteric question that's about whether the UN should have more authority over governments that don't meet their full obligations under the UDHR. And so I just want to invite any panelists to answer either of these questions. If anyone would like to speak about this. Wonderful. We have one brave soul. Thank you so much, sir. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Muchas gracias. He visto además que una de las preguntas se hacía desde España y por eso quiero contestar, ¿no? La protección de las personas sin techo, pertenecientes o no a la comunidad LGTBI, es responsabilidad de los ayuntamientos y de los gobiernos regionales, ¿no? Tienen los medios y muchas veces, la mayor parte de las veces, se canalizan los fondos a través de organizaciones no gubernamentales, organizaciones de la sociedad civil. Me consta que las principales organizaciones de derechos LGTBI en España están ayudando en estos casos, puesto que la dinámica, ¿no? y la idiosincrasia de las personas LGTBI e incluso dentro de las personas LGTBI no es lo mismo una persona L que una G que una persona transgénero, por ejemplo. No, hay unas situaciones muy diferentes que deben ser abordadas de modo diferente. Respecto a la otra pregunta, yo creo que todos los que pertenecemos a la comunidad de derechos humanos y creemos en la importancia de proteger los derechos humanos, nos gustaría que hubiese un sistema más poderoso a nivel internacional de obligar al cumplimiento de los derechos. En el ámbito de los derechos LGTBQ, ni siquiera tenemos un instrumento internacional, no existe, como en el caso de la Convención para la Eliminación de Discriminación Racial o la Convención de Derechos del Niño o de las personas con discapacidad. No existe todavía un convenio internacional. Si lo hubiera, ¿no?, los países firmantes sí que tendrían una obligación internacional de dar cuentas al respecto.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your remarks, and also to the participant from the audience for naming the very serious issue of the ongoing and pervasive issues of homelessness impacting the LGBTIQ community and the way it's been exacerbated in the context of the pandemic. We have two final speakers. We have a question, I believe, that will be posed by the Permanent Representative of Canada, His Excellency Robert Keith Ray. Sir, if you'd like to turn your camera on and pose your question, you have the floor.
I have to say, Jessica, very, very formal introduction. Everyone here at the UN knows me as Bob. I'm delighted to be able to join this conversation. I think it's truly remarkable what is being done today, and I think it's a wonderful expression of how things are changing, but not changing quickly enough. So I guess that's my question: is what more can we do to reaffirm our common humanity and to make sure that we're taking all the steps we can to include LGBTI in everything we do, in our public statements, but more importantly in our actions? And how can we fight hatred? Because I think the real thing we're dealing with today is hatred. And how can governments do more? And how can the UN community do more? And how can we take the practical steps to make that happen? But I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and to listen, and it's been a wonderful experience, and it is worth recalling that 50 years ago, or 40 years ago, 30 years ago, 20 years ago, this would not be happening the way that it is. And I think that's a dramatic change that we should all be celebrating today.
Well, I'll take the liberty of saying, Bob, I agree with you.
Please.
No, thank you. And thank you for asking the big, hard questions. I mean, I think you asked them in a rhetorical way to every one of us, the speakers, the audience members, the journalists who thankfully joined to report on this event. Those are the right questions. What are the public statements that we need? What is the action that we need? How do we fight hatred in a long-term context? What more can governments in the UN do? I would say, if the Zoom gods would permit us to stretch this event from 1 hour to 1 month, that we could give you a very long list of things to do. But it's not really about one thing, right? It's about governments asking where the gaps are, and being interested in the questions that you've just posed. I'm going to wrap up my own thoughts, but I just want to say something that a colleague from Belize, Caleb Orozco, just messaged to me, which I think is really essential. And it's related to all of this. What are we doing to ensure that the COVID vaccine is accessible globally? And especially that those countries that have stockpiles of the vaccine are sharing it at the global level. This, for me, is part of how we queer the COVID response. It's not just about creating community-based interventions. It's about realizing that unless we approach the COVID pandemic as a global community rather than solely as nation states, we won't come through this together. And those of us who work full-time for LGBTIQ rights are really calling on our allies in states, in the UN, in the multilateral financial institutions to create vaccine access for everyone. And we're calling for the call that Liberty made so eloquently, which is to say, let's build back better. Let's not just think about giving everyone the vaccine, but still not having access to gender identity recognition for transgender people, right? We need to do more. So with that, I'm going to introduce our final speaker. I want to say that I feel motivated to build back better, and I feel motivated to do more things in honor of IDAHOT as a result of this inspiring panel. And I'm so pleased that the final speaker and the person who will conclude the event for us is His Excellency Fabian Odone, the Charge d'Affaires of the Argentine Republic, who is offering the concluding remarks. Minister, you have the floor.
Muchas gracias, Jessica. Muchas gracias a la embajadora Brand. Muchas gracias a la embajada de los Países Bajos. Muchas gracias a Outright Action International y a todos los que hicieron posible este diálogo intenso, este diálogo importante que tenemos sobre un tema importante. Hoy es un día de celebración, es cierto, pero también es un día en que tenemos que recordar el desafío que tenemos por delante. Es un desafío que para la Argentina es un desafío importante, es un desafío serio, es un desafío esencial. Sabemos, somos conscientes de la discriminación, cómo actúa y cuán seria, cuán mucho más seria es cuando las personas, las víctimas son las personas LGTBI. La estigmatización, la violencia, la exclusión. Y tenemos desde el Estado argentino la convicción de que no hay, ni puede haber ninguna sociedad libre, ni ninguna sociedad justa, ni ninguna sociedad igualitaria que no resuelva desde las bases ese problema. Esta es la base de nuestra acción política, esta es la base de una de nuestras más sólidas políticas de Estado. Nosotros queremos que todas las voces estén presentes en el diseño, en la elaboración, en la ejecución de las políticas. Cuando se trata de cuestiones dirigidas a solucionar problemas que permitan el disfrute pleno de los derechos de las personas LGTBI, entonces son esas personas las que deben estar presentes en todas esas instancias. Nosotros por eso estamos muy contentos desde la misión de Argentina de la participación de la subsecretaria Alba Rueda, porque no hay mejor ejemplo de eso. Es decir, todas las personas que están involucradas en estas políticas tienen que participar activamente, no ser meros espectadores. Nosotros quisiéramos recalcar y quisiéramos hacer nuestro para terminar apenas con lo que dijo el secretario general y que para nosotros es nuestro curso de acción. Queremos un mundo más inclusivo, queremos un mundo más justo, donde no importe quién es, dónde viva o a quiénes amen las personas. Para eso estamos trabajando. Muchísimas gracias por permitirnos participar en esta discusión.
Thank you so much, Minister. Well, thank you all. If you're an LGBTIQ person, do something extra nice for yourself. Get a massage, have a nice meal, have someone hug you. And if you're an ally who cares about LGBTIQ human rights, thank you for your support. Do something good for an LGBTIQ person in your life or at the law and policy level. And I wish you all a meaningful and happy International Day Against Homophobia, Biphobia, Transphobia, and all other forms of intolerance. We send love out to all of you. Bye-bye.